Hi, welcome to another day at Cemetery of Choice. It is July 17th, and the anniversary we're going to look at today is going to give us a picture of abortion as it was being practiced in Oklahoma in 1940. But it is also bringing up some issues that are very relevant to just the abortion rights movement in general. Not pro-choice people, but that kind of coalesced um, group of activists that, originally they had made their purpose kind of a dual purpose of making sure women get hooked up with abortions and making sure abortion was legal, and um, just how other things have played out. So on July 17th, 1940, Goldie, the 28-year-old wife of an Oklahoma City milk truck driver, died of peritonitis from an abortion that had been performed on July 2nd by Otto Lucy. And even after years of checking up for new information, the fact that his name is Lucy just kind of brings up female to me and keeps making me think it's talking about a woman, but Lucy is the doctor. Lucy is not I Love Lucy. So Lucy was a 37-year-old psychologist and teacher who had previously been dean of men at Central State College. Um, and I want you to set aside for a moment the fact that he was a psychologist, because that's going to become relevant when we look at the abortion rights movement. Um, so Goldie's husband, Albert, admitted that he had purchased some abortifacients for his wife, but they hadn't had their desired effect. So Lucy had a listing in the phone book calling himself Dr. Otto C. Lucy, and there he is, Dr. Otto Lucy, very big picture of him. Possibly because he was a psychologist. He wasn't licensed, but he was actually a consulting psychologist for a prison. At any rate, Albert saw Otto Lucy's ad in the phone book, thought he was a doctor, and he went and he said that he didn't have any money, so Lucy said he couldn't do anything for them. So Albert evidently either found the money or he worked out some kind of arrangement, because on July 2nd, Lucy went to the Crow home at dusk and performed an abortion on Goldie. And something I've mentioned in other videos, we have to keep in mind that abortion rights activists talk about these kitchen table abortions as though they, through the eyes of modern people for whom you go into the hospital for operations. I have an obstetrical nursing book from the 1930s in my library, and one chapter teaches the nurse how to set up the woman's kitchen table for an operating table to perform an emergency C-section. Kitchen table surgery was not in and of itself some weird, shocking thing. It was certainly falling well out of favor by the 1940s, but even in the 1930s, doctors were still doing C-sections in kitchens. I think it has to do more with the area people lived in, kind of the culture of the people in that area. So we need to view that in context. It wasn't as shocking to them as it is to us that they would perform surgery in a kitchen. Now, at some point that evening, Lucy called a nurse to assist him, and sometime afterward, he came back to check on Goldie, found her condition improved, and said she should drink fruit juice and plenty of water. But over the next few days, her condition deteriorated. Albert called Dr. Lucy, who said he'd done all he could and that Albert should take Goldie to a hospital. So Albert called the family doctor, who also said to take Goldie to a hospital. So Albert called a taxi, and by the time he got Goldie to the hospital, it was too late to do anything for her. And another thing that we need to keep in mind, the abortion rights movement wants you to totally blame Goldie's death on the legal status of abortion, and they're forgetting that this was prior to antibiotics and prior to blood transfusions. These are things that did not come to the American public by and large until World War II, when this was, it's sad but true, war always forwards emergency medicine. It's just the way things are. You have to. So I don't know why they were unable to save her, but I would guess that it was the days before antibiotics. So during an investigation into the abortion, police found surgical instruments wrapped in a towel and bloody newspaper stuffed into a garbage can in the basement of the apartment building where Lucy lived. So he was convicted of first-degree manslaughter on April 17, 1941, and sentenced to 25 years for Goldie's death. And after he was convicted for Goldie's death, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the death of Mary Ellen Legg, who had died from a botched abortion that Lucy performed 2 years earlier. And the only information I can find about Mary Ellen's death is lumped in with the articles about Goldie's death. But they, oh yeah, 2 years ago, he had another abortion patient die. So Lucy pleaded guilty to manslaughter in her death, and also pleaded guilty to obtaining an abortion in the case of a 27-year-old stenographer that he performed an abortion on in November of 1938. So that was shortly after Mary Ellen died. And this is something that just, it drives me crazy. I mean, it's not happening in the here and now, but I feel like it is, where obviously they knew something was going on in 1938. Mary Ellen Legg died, and this stenographer, if they found out about her abortion, it was almost certainly because she wound up in the hospital because of it, and they didn't shut him down. This guy's not a doctor, he's a psychologist. He's doing abortions. Like I said, that stenographer probably wound up in the hospital. Mary Ellen ended up dead. Now, like, whatever. And this, like and subscribe. I need to get monetized so I can get money, so I can look into what the hell was going through people's heads that they let this stuff happen. And Lucy was paroled May 26, 1945, after serving just a hair over 4 years. And now in retrospect, looking at it, I probably should do a newspapers.com search and see if he went straight back to doing abortions, because they often do that. So now my sources for this story, we've got this article. Here's a list of the articles I used at the time. And then I found some additional sources here. Okay. Including an advertisement for actual detective stories. So I'm going to have to interlibrary loan, get a copy of actual detective stories, because it looks at why was it that Otto Lucy was able to continue practicing even after Mary Ellen died. Why was he allowed to keep practicing until he killed Goldie? So that's a little bit of research I'm going to have to do. But a couple of kind of related notes I want to bring back. So he's out on bail pending trial for the first woman's death. This actually happened with legal abortion. This guy, Dr. Jesse Ketchum. Now, the story of Dr. Jesse Ketchum just really underlies some of these, because he bridges that period between pre-legalization abortion and abortion on demand. And I think the story of how his career plays out has some important lessons for us. So before legalization, he had an abortion practice aside, a legitimate but somewhat lawsuit-prone medical practice in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I have found no evidence that any of his patients died, although he was arrested 3 times for perpetrating abortions and gotten in some other trouble for some other things. But clergy consultation services found out about him, and Ketchum, he kept abortion instruments in his house and did the abortions in a motel room, which is like, you've got an office! You just have them come in and you pretend you're doing something legit. Why are you doing this sneaky weird shit that calls attention to yourself? That's one of the things about some of these doctors who were doing illegal abortions that just mystifies me. Now, the term back alley abortion didn't refer to the abortion being done in the back alley. It was that the woman came in through the back alley. Sometimes they'd have them come in after hours. And that could be because, typically for a consult, you come in, doctor talks to you for 10, 15 minutes and you're gone. Whereas this was long before the 5-minute suction abortion. This could take a while. And in a lot of the pre-legalization cases, the older ones, sometimes they're spending an hour doing these abortions because they didn't have the tools that made it a little bit easier and faster. So clergy consultation services was Protestant ministers and rabbis, and it existed just to hook women up with abortionists. So they started sending women to him. Maybe part of why they picked him was because he wasn't, botching things. He seemed like a safe place. So he was arrested in either late 79 or early 70 after a sting where a policewoman arranged for an abortion. So the Michigan Women's Commission and Clergy Consultation Services responded to Ketchum's arrest by starting a drive to repeal the laws against abortion. Which, that makes sense if you think that abortion is something that should be readily available, and this guy got arrested just for doing it and hadn't done a woman, because if you're for abortion, the fetus is presumed to be disposable. You get rid of that thing. That's the whole point. So the prosecutor objected to feeling forced to prosecute Ketchum because he also favored abortion rights. So that was kind of sitting in limbo. So New York legalized abortion on demand in 1970. So Ketchum, he was 52 at the time. His wife Judith was nearly 30 years his junior. He went and set up shop. He was doing abortions the day they were legal in New York. I think it was July 1st, 1970. In a motel room, because I guess he was comfortable in motel rooms. And New York must have seemed like the promised land because abortionists were flaunting safety standards with impunity. They were doing things like injecting patients with saline. Saline abortions, they'd pull out a lot of amniotic fluid with one of those ginormous needles and replace it with a really strong salt solution that pickled fetus. I mean, it would kill the baby. It was a horrible way for these babies to die. The nurses in abortion wards referred to them as candy apple babies because they came out with their skin just scalded from how strong this salt was. It was also dangerous to the mothers, and that's a whole nother topic. So, I mean, they were doing this and just sending them home. And, some of them died because they're sent home and they're getting amniotic fluid embolisms, they're bleeding out, horrible things are happening to these women, and nobody's getting thrown into jail for it. So it's like, oh shit, I can do anything I want. This is pretty groupie. And clergy consultation services kept referring women to Ketchum in his new location. Now, eventually he opened an office. He didn't stay in a motel suite. So the first kind of trouble he gets into is doing a D&C under general anesthesia in his office. And the woman discovered that he had really ripped her up inside and then told her that the abortion had been without complications. Now, if he had done this in Michigan, where abortion was still legal, it really would have brought the heat down on him. They wouldn't have been able to say this was a victimless crime. And getting away with that seemed to make him even bolder. So Ketchum started doing what's called hysterotomy abortions. And hysterotomy is basically a mini C-section. I mean, this is surgery. It's cutting open the uterus to get the baby out. The only difference between a hysterotomy and a C-section is that you intend a dead baby. And, they were typically done before the baby could survive anyway. You take out the baby, just let it lay there, gasp out its life. But he's doing these. Now, he was doing them vaginally. So, yeah, he's at least not cutting through all her abdominal tissue, but he goes in above the cervix, slices open the uterus, pulls out the baby, lets it die of prematurity, stitch the incision back up, send her home. Well, a woman named Margaret traveled from Michigan to New York because she'd been exposed to rubella, and she feared that the baby would have some birth defects, was the term they used at the time. So Ketchum's doing one of these hysterotomies. He did it about 10:30 in the morning of June 16th, 71, and then left Margaret virtually unattended until her boyfriend returned at 2 p.m., found Margaret unresponsive, and begged Ketchum to do something. So they summoned emergency medical services. They were unable to revive Margaret. They took her across the street to a hospital where she was pronounced dead on arrival. So he could have sent her across the street, across the freaking street. He and his nurse, if he had one, could have put her on a gurney and just wheeled her across the street. She had bled to death. So Ketchum was pretty much astounded because he was charged with criminally negligent homicide in Margaret's death. I mean, he sliced her open and then let her bleed to death. So he was out on bail, and he kept doing these outpatient hysterotomies, the same dangerous procedure that had killed Margaret. And he killed Margaret in June, July, August, September, October. 4 weeks later, a woman was referred from Ohio. He did the same thing to her, except he at least sent her to a hospital instead of just letting her bleed out in the office. So he got to kill a second woman before he was actually stopped. He served a little time, received less than a year, relocated to Florida, and went to work in a VA hospital. So he's just a quack. And what's interesting is a former criminal abortionist was hired to testify on Ketchum's behalf, and that's Milan Vooch. He had been deliberately and openly doing abortions in Washington, D.C., so he could challenge the abortion law. And Clergy Consultation Services had sent Bernard Nathanson, who at the time was like this big abortion guru. He was one of the founders of what was then the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, that's now called National Abortion Rights Action. Actually, National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League, NARAL Pro-Choice America. In his book, Aborting America, Nathanson admits that he was checking out Vooch's illegal practice. A little bit iffy, but hey, he does abortions good enough. Managed not to kill any women until it became legal, and he got even sloppier and killed 2 safe legal abortion patients. And he died an abortion rights hero. The 2 dead women, we don't see them. And Benjamin Munson, that's this guy. He was an abortionist in Rapid City, South Dakota. And again, he was an illegal abortionist. And when abortion was made legal, he got sloppy again and he killed 2 patients. And abortion rights activists just rallied around him. He was prosecuted for both of those deaths because, as the prosecutor in the Linda Padfield case put it, said, you pull out a 3-inch leg, there's got to be more still in there. And both of these young women, he sent them home with huge chunks of fetus still in them, which it caused bleeding, it caused hemorrhage. Of course, they're going to die. So, and these 2 guys died heroes to the abortion rights movement. Wilma and Georgiana that Ketchum killed, and Linda and Yvonne that Munson killed, don't need to worry about them. They're just women. So then there's the fact that Otto Lucy was just a psychologist, and that just brings me right to Harvey Karman. And Harvey Karman, when he died, he got the most hagiographic obituaries from abortion supporters. Everybody described him as flamboyant. He was just he was such a flake. He fancied himself a doctor, so he called himself Dr. Harvey Karman, and he awarded himself a PhD from an imaginary university in Europe so that he can call himself Dr. Karman. And he was a dropout from the master's program at UCLA Theater Arts. So he didn't have a lot of education, but he had limitless chutzpah and an unflagging enthusiasm for abortion. This was this man's life. And what did he do? In 1955, he killed a young woman by doing an illegal abortion on her with a nutcracker in a hotel room. I mean, what the hell are you thinking? And he went to jail for that, but he got pardoned by Jerry Brown when Jerry Brown became governor. And like a prison record is like a badge of honor for an abortionist. So after he was released, his career really took off. So he began administering. He was an administrator of a California abortion hospital, and he set up an experimental program using what he called supercoils, which I'll get to that in a minute. He credited himself with inventing menstrual extraction, which is use a big syringe to create suction, and you slurp out. It's very early in the pregnancy where you just kind of slurp out the fetus. And abortion was legal at this time, and women would still have home abortion parties where they didn't know whether they were pregnant or not, but once a month they'd all get together like a Tupperware party and get giant syringes and vacuum each other out. You can't make this shit up. And I found evidence that some women still gather together and do this. I guess it's kind of this little bonding exercise. It's bizarre. It's bizarre what the hell goes on in people's heads. And then he also invented a flexible suction cannula, which frankly is probably the same kind that they use in the dentist's office when you're getting your teeth cleaned and they slurp out all the water and drool. He invented that flexible cannula, which, granted, that is a legitimate medical advance. The fact that it was invented to be used for abortion is the main reason that there was nothing else he could do that could possibly make them look on him with a jaded eye. So he invented these things that he called supercoils. Now, let's step aside to the culture of Alaskan Native American tribes. There was one method of hunting polar bears that they would use, which it seems really cruel to us, but when you live where there isn't a whole lot else to eat and you need to eat a polar bear, you need to find a way to kill the polar bear without getting killed. So what these hunters would do was they would get some blubber and warm it in their mouths because it's cold. And they would take a bit of really flexible bone, like rib bone from another animal, and they would wind it up really, really tight. And they soften this blubber in their mouth, and they take it out and real quick stuff that bone into it, and it would freeze instantly because it's so cold. And they would leave this bit of blubber for the polar bears to come eat. It would go in the polar bear's gullet, and spring, as soon as the blubber melted, this bone would open up, and it would just rip up the polar bear's digestive tract as it made its way through, and the bear would eventually die from that. And it's the same freaking principle with these damn supercoils. Like, what was going on in this man's head? Where these were plastic springs, sharp plastic springs that were wadded up, and there was some kind of substance that they were embedded in, kind of the equivalent of the blubber. And so Harvey Karman was advertising these as making second trimester abortions so safe that untrained lay people could just go around, stick these supercoils in women's wombs. And the idea was that when her body heat melted these would spring open and kill the fetus, and then she'd expel it. On what planet is this a good idea? And I can't remember which happened first, the Bangladesh experiment or Mother's Day in Philly. But in Bangladesh, he used these supercoils, these plastic springs, and balsa wood. He was sent there by the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Planned freaking Parenthood sent this guy who had killed a woman in a motel room with a nutcracker, sent this guy to Bangladesh to do this abortion experiment on women who had been raped by soldiers. You know, the government of Bangladesh asked for help from Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, hey, let's send Harvey. These are poor women of color. What can possibly go wrong? And he used his supercoils and balsa wood. This is freaking model airplane parts, plastic springs and balsa wood. And Planned Parenthood is sending him there. And I mean, they documented that some of these women nearly died. Who knows how many of them actually did die, because he just inserted the supercoils in the balsa wood and send them home. Someplace where there's really no possibility for medical follow-up. Oh, yeah, so he did the Bangladesh first. So he nearly killed a lot of patients. So he goes back to the U.S. looking for more guinea pigs. So, you know, at the time, this was 1972. So this was before abortion was legalized nationwide. There was the Jane Abortion Syndicate in Chicago, which was a bunch of lay women. They had a doctor at first doing the abortions. So they were pretty much a referral service, and they'd get the women to the doctor. And then I can't remember why they lost their doctor. I can't remember if he quit or retired or got arrested. But they decided, what the hell, we can do this ourselves. And they had Harvey Karman come and train them in how to do abortions. Having Harvey Karman come and train them. What is going on in these people's minds? Oh, and this woman who wrote a book about the Jane Syndicate, listen to the pseudonym she gave him. Jordan Bennett. This is like a bodice ripper romance hero's name. This guy's named Harvey. You know, Jordan Bennett. So the Jane abortion ring got raided. So all of their lay abortionists were in prison, and they had these poor minority women who had been scheduled for second trimester abortions. So they decided to charter a bus and send them all to Philadelphia, where Kermit Gosnell, yes, that Kermit Gosnell, was running an illegal abortion clinic, while Arlen Specter, who later became a senator, was the district attorney, and he kind of, well, yeah, I'll just kind of not pay attention to it. For Harvey and Kermit Gosnell to do these supercoil abortions. Now, I don't know whether they had even bothered to find out what had happened to these women in Bangladesh. Yeah, the only thing that matters is the abortion happens. That's something that just drives me crazy. It's like, if she's dead, at least the abortion still happened. I totally don't understand. If somebody can explain this to me, why you would look at your friend or your neighbor or your sister and go, yeah, she might die, but at least the baby will be dead. I mean, I can't understand that mindset. I really can't. Now, some local feminists did not like this idea. They knew this was an experiment. So these women were brought into Gosnell's clinic, and the Jane Abortion Syndicate invited a public television camera crew down from New York to film this whole thing. Unfortunately, the footage has been lost, probably because, shit, this was against the law. We're going to get in trouble. You know, and destroyed it. But, you know, some local feminists who supported abortion, it wasn't abortion they were opposed to, it was doing this experiment on these women, because Gosnell and Karman were open about the fact that they were doing this. The DA knew that they were doing this. And this feminist group was outside letting the air out of the bus tires and protesting. So they packed these women full of supercoils. One woman wound up hospitalized there in Philadelphia. Some more got hospitalized after they went back to Chicago. So, yeah, out of the 15 women they did this, 9 of the 13 that they could track down had complications. And The health department in Pennsylvania took notice of this. They reported it to the Centers for Disease Control, who wrote it up, and they gave the world's most tepid condemnation. Listen to how half-hearted this slap on the wrist to Harvey was. Until the supercoil abortion technique is demonstrated to be safe in the hands of competent medical personnel in a controlled research setting, CDC findings suggest that it is not appropriate for use by paramedical personnel. So, this Otto Lucy being a psychologist, abortion supporters totally did not care. They didn't care that Harvey was just a psychologist, and what's more, hadn't even graduated. They did not care that he had killed Joyce Johnson. They sent women back to him after this supercoil fiasco in Bangladesh. So, I can't attribute a whole lot of what happened with Otto Lucy to the fact that abortion was illegal. It being illegal didn't stop Kermit Gosnell, who was a doctor, from doing what he was doing in Philly. There's this infatuation with abortion where the woman herself doesn't seem to matter anymore. And that seems to be the case with Goldie Crow. When Mary Ellen Legg died, so that's kind of the theme that just won't quit.